Okay, now I'm recording this class. I have this lecture up from last semester as well, so we can reference that. And you guys have all these notes. And you will not be tested on this section of things. Thank you for the heads up, Jimbo. So you guys got introduced to the idea of the 5 elements last semester. Some of you had known about it in advance. But my guess is that most of you learned about this, right? The generating and controlling cycle. Let me make that a little bit bigger. It's slightly awkward. So normally the way this gets taught is going to be like this. This should be familiar to everyone. So we get this nice circle with a pentagram in the middle, or really just the whole thing's a pentagram, right? This is our generating and controlling cycles. Normally when you're taught the 5 elements, this is how you're taught it. This is only one of a number of ways to visualize and understand the 5 elements. And I'm going to present a different one today. This is mentioned briefly in Maciocia, but he doesn't go into a whole lot of detail. If you get into non-Chinese medicine aspects of Chinese philosophy, what you're going to see is that, so this is generally called the generating and controlling cycle. We have another one called the celestial cross. And we're going to be referencing this much more than the generating and controlling cycle within this class. Some of your other students will not have heard of this at all. That's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. It looks like this. Pretty straightforward. It's still just 5, but instead of being organized as a pentagram, we're organized as a cross. This allows us to do a few things. So when we look at the 5 elements in this manner, we're getting a lot of information about how these different elements interact. And this is mostly teaching us about pathology. This is mostly teaching us about how things go wrong and how to intervene. If you have too much water, you can control it with earth. If you have too little water, you can generate it with metal. That's the basics of that organization. What the celestial cross allows us to do is relate this to yin and yang directly. I'm be using a little bit of shorthand in this class. Downward pointing triangle is going to be yin. Upward pointing triangle is going to be yang. I would strongly recommend that all of you get comfortable using shorthand because you're going to be taking a lot of notes for quite a few years on a lot of material. I'm teaching an herbs class this evening. We're going to spend about half an hour just talking about how to do shorthand for herbs to make it fast enough that it's easier to learn. What we can do with this is say, well, water is the most yin of these 5, and fire is the most yang. Actually, let's simplify this a little bit further. Let's see what we got. Yeah, okay. We'll come back to my drawing in just a second. So this is how Maciocia presents it. Same idea. He's got his squiggly lines a little bit more complicated. He talks about this as the 5 element seasonal cycle, but he mentions it as the celestial cross as well. Let's look at the significance of this. So the 5 phases, so okay, first off, you get taught this as 5 elements. 5 phases is a little bit of a better translation. I'm going to be using the 2 interchangeably in this class. 5 elements is, we ended up with 5 elements because the people who were originally translating this material had knowledge of Greek medicine, and they thought to themselves, oh, this 5 thing looks a lot like the 4 elements we have within Greek philosophy and Greek medicine. But it's a terrible translation. 5 elements give the impression that these are all static things. 5 phases, it's a little closer to phases of the moon. Each one becomes the next one. These aren't static points, they're variations on a theme. So in theory, if we can derive from first principles all of Chinese medicine, we should be able to get from yin and yang to the 5 phases. Sorry, this is a little more disjointed than I wanted it to be. I miss having a whiteboard. So let's talk about it this way. If water is the most yin, let's do it here. Water is the most yin, and fire is the most yang. We need to be able to get from water to fire and back. This is yin and yang transforming into each other. This is what happens consistently in the body. Within our organs, this would be the heart up here, and this would be the kidneys down here, as holding our deepest reservoir of water and our highest reservoir of fire. But as we go through these movements, there's a lot of change occurring. And what we begin saying is, well, let's call this movement itself something. Like, there's not a point in the middle here where the two are balanced. It's got a different nature. Like this right here and this right here are different. In theory, they should be the same, but the directionality changes it. So what we're going to call these is the movement from water to fire is wood, and the movement from fire to water is metal. We use the terms yang within yin and yin within yang for these, which is to say, as yin transforms into yang, we pass through a portion of it where the yang is rising and the yin is falling. We're going to call that wood. When yang rises and yin falls, when we're creating yang and moving away from yin, we call that wood. When we go from yang to yin, when we go from fire to water, we call it yin within yang. Yin is rising, yang is falling, we call that metal. This making sense to people? You guys with me a little bit here, or are people completely lost at this stage? It's a little harder to tell that over Zoom. I'm seeing some of this going on. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Okay, we're going to keep going, and hopefully this will continue to make more sense as we go. So as we move from water to fire, we pass through yang within yin. We call that wood. Fire to water, pass through yin within yang, we call that metal. So this gives us 4 of the phases. Water, wood, fire, metal, and back. And it's almost like we can chart this on a graph. Right? So down here, we've got the most yin. As it rises up, it becomes more yang. And we just get this nice little circle. Easy, straightforward. We only get 4 here. So we put earth in the middle as the thing that holds all of this wheel together. So would someone put in the chat the yin wood organ? Great, thank you, Kira. Liver. So when we say wood, this is really just a shorthand for yang within yin. We're just calling it wood. And when we think liver being the yin aspect of wood, we're talking about the yin aspect of yang within yin. That's a very cumbersome sentence to say, so we get these shorthands for it. But really, if we're looking at if we're looking at this image from earlier, what this is into is we get the Tao at the bottom, we get Yin, we get Yang, we get Yin, we get Yang, we get Yin, we get Yang. Seems repetitive and a little bit silly, but we're going to call this one fire. We're going to call this one metal. We call this one water. Call this one wood. And then off of each of these, we get yin and yang again. So if we come to just the wood one as an example, we get yin and yang. And we're going to call that liver. We're going to call that gallbladder. This is really as far as we're going to take this for now. The idea here is that all of these are just placeholders for talking about yin and yang. That's pretty much all of Chinese medicine, is the words yin and yang combined in complicated, more and more complicated ways to describe different things. But as soon as I start saying the yin aspect of yang within yin interacting with the yang aspect of yang within yang, I've lost myself along with most of you. So we use other words for these things. I want you to keep in the back of your head for this semester, and I'll remind you about this when we get to organs, that when we say liver, we're still just talking about yin and yang. When we say fire, we're still just talking about yin and yang. There's nothing additional or special there. There's nothing separate there. We start with this holistic idea of the Tao, of this oneness. We turn it into duality, and everything else from Chinese medicine emanates out from that. So if you ever start to feel like aspects of the medicine are disjointed, one of the questions you can ask to supervisors or to professors is, how does this connect back to yin and yang? And in general, they should be able to answer those questions. There are exceptions, but in general, they should be able to answer that question. And if everything if all of the pieces of Chinese medicine are able to integrate back into here, then you've got kind of a unified way of thinking about it. And once you've got that unified way of thinking about it, it becomes easier to practice. If this only makes partial sense, don't worry too much about it. There's a lot there. And like I said, you're not going to be tested on this. But for some of you, especially with a philosophical background, this may be a little bit helpful as a starting place.
Peter, can I ask
Yes.
a question? Yes. So would Earth have arrows from the original yin and yang? So that, because the yin is separated, the yang is separated, but would Earth be yin and yang, almost like creating a diamond from Tao to yin and yang back to Earth?
So what Earth ends up doing here, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more next week. We're actually going to take this concept, redo it, and expand upon it next week. Earth is going to represent a balance point between these two things that's always there. Just double check that this isn't something I'm talking about today. I redid these slides, so things are in a little bit of a different order. No, we're not going to cover that today. So I'll just give a brief introduction to this. Earth is going to function as the center of this thing that keeps it moving. So yin and yang want to separate. They don't like being together particularly. So we need, other forces to hold everything together. And that's largely what Earth is doing. Like, as you learned in FCM1, like yin and yang are mutually controlling and mutually consuming and like they balance each other out in all these different ways. One of the ways we describe death in Chinese medicine is the separation of yin and yang. So Earth functions almost as the hub of the wheel that these spokes rotate around. And we're going to go deeper into that concept next week. That help? Okay. So, the main reason I'm introducing this idea right now, like I said, we're going to go a little further into it next week, is because as the Confucian idea of rectification of terms is very important. When I talk to you, when I say liver, when I say gallbladder, when I say heart, when I say wood, I want to make sure that what I mean and what you hear are the same thing. And very often these concepts are introduced as learn the 5 elements and that's it. And I want to make sure that you guys are getting that when I say these things, this is what we're talking about. So this is what we mean when we say holistic. There are not discrete pieces. These are, we start with Tao, we start with this oneness, and then we find ways to divide it up, but it's still a whole being divided to become functional. So when I say that, one of the ways I've heard this described in discussion with a friend of mine who does some theosophy work, one of the ways we talked about it is, if we look at the Tao and the way it's treated within different systems, Chinese medicine is going to divide it something like this so that we can look at it in pieces and work with it. Other systems will divide it differently, talking about the exact same thing. And whichever system you use, whichever way you're looking at this wholeness, it gives you different abilities to work with it. But ultimately, this oneness is consistent. So when we say holistic, that's what we're talking about. Everything is interconnected. And in this case, it's on a foundation of yin and yang. Everything goes back to yin and yang. If things don't go back to yin and yang, then we're not really talking about Chinese medicine anymore. We're talking about something else, because that's what Chinese medicine is based on. So that, to me, begs an important question, which is any of this true? Is yin and yang real? Is the Tao real? Are the 5 elements, the 5 phases real? Are these organs and the way that we're talking about them real? And the answer, in my opinion, is that's a bad question. It's not a useful question, because what we care about with these systems, with the heuristic, with the models that we use to look at the body within Chinese medicine, is, does the person return to balance and harmony through the utilization of these concepts? Like, is qi real? Well, it's not real in the same way that a person's bones are real. It's not real in a way that we can put on a scale. But is it functionally useful? Absolutely. It doesn't really matter if it's real within a materialistic sense, because that's not the way in which we're looking at things anyways. So all of this, the 5 phases, yin and yang, Tao, the organ systems, really everything you're going to learn in the entire FCM series is a way of looking at the body that gets us to the results we want to get to. It's a functional way of looking at things. So a question of, like, can we discover a new phase? We've been talking about 5 elements, 5 phases for at least 2,300 years. Could someone come along and discover a 6th phase? Well, we've got this division into 5 here. Why not do it as 6? That could tell us more things. And the answer is, you could absolutely create a system that works around dividing into 6. It just wouldn't be Chinese medicine anymore. It would be something else. And we see that within the Greek system, where we're dividing into 4. You see this within a lot of like Lakota traditions, which also tend to work with cardinal directions in a base 4 system of dividing things. We have different ways of talking about unity to get to a functional way of working with it. And within Chinese medicine, we've chosen some ways to do that. And then we built this entire medicine on top of it. Anyone have any questions about that? If that's a little bit confusing, that's okay. Don't worry if you're half with me and half not with that. These are partially just seeds to plant for future aspects of your education. We're generally starting a little bit airier and a little bit more philosophical, and we're going to ground down very heavily around the midterm. So if this is a little fuzzy, don't worry too much. But if you have questions, I'm open to them. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about a little bit is naming within Chinese medicine. So obviously, everything that we're talking about has a Chinese character associated with it. We're translating, as seen on the screen here, we're translating this character, Xin, as heart. But when we do that, there are people here who speak multiple languages, right? I mean, we've got a number of Korean students, at least one Russian. There are people who speak multiple languages. I speak English and pretty good Spanish. You can't really translate one-to-one. Meanings always change when you translate, right? Well, we have this problem in Chinese medicine that a lot of the words that we use, when we translate them into English, people who have a background in English, especially people who have a background in biomedicine and in science, get the wrong impression about what we're talking about. So the character for heart, the character we translate as heart is Xin, but it doesn't mean the same thing as the Western medicine concept of heart. And we need to talk about that because this causes some strange types of confusion in students as they're learning Chinese medicine. So if we were to map out what the heart is, within Chinese medicine, well, within Western medicine, let's start there. In the center of this map, if I were to ask a Western physician, tell me what the heart is, map it out for me, we would put in the center a physical heart. I am not an artist. This would be the centerpiece. We'd have a physical heart extracted from a person as the center thing. And then off of this, we would have, you know, cardiac muscle is going to be a part of it. Off of this, we're going to have rhythmicity and rhythms. We're going to have circulation. We're going to have all sorts of different things. Connections to the pericardium are going to be here. This is the basic way in which we would be mapping this out. Everything would be ultimately connected to this physical heart that we have in front of us. This is not what happens when we do this within Chinese medicine. The central piece of this is going to be the character. And off of this, one of the branches is going to be the physical heart. But another one is going to be the Shen, the person's spirit. Another one is going to be Yin, fire. Another one is going, and off of this branch of the physical heart, we're going to have the same things we're looking at here. Another one here is going to be, well, we already have Shen. We're going to have connections to production of blood. Now, if we're looking at this from a Western perspective, there's no way that we're putting production of blood as one of the functions of the heart. That's just not remotely accurate within Western medicine. And that's because when we're talking about Xin within Chinese medicine, we're only kind of talking about the heart. We're also talking about that which produces blood. Even though that's not the heart in the chest, we were never talking about the heart in the chest. We're talking about this larger concept. So one of the examples I like to use with this is why does this matter? When we're looking at these phrases that get translated, everyone in their first year is confused about what the Sanjiao is, which is standard. But most people think they understand blood because it's familiar. So we translate this word shui as blood. But if we were to map it out in the same way that we just did the heart, we get a whole bunch of things that don't fit with blood at all. When most students begin learning these ideas, they approach the Sanjiao correctly. They've got Sanjiao at the center of their circle, and then a whole bunch of question marks coming off of it. We're going to cover the Sanjiao in week 10, and we're going to talk about it then. But over here, they've got blood, and they go, oh, I know what that is. That's the red substance in blood vessels. That's going to carry nutrients through the body. Like, I got a basic understanding of blood because of my biology background. But when we're talking in Chinese medicine, how about houses the memory? And as soon as we put that there, anyone who has a Western medicine background related to the blood that we have in our veins will go, that makes no sense. Memories aren't housed in the blood. And they're right, but we're not talking about blood. We're talking about shui, which we translate as blood. It's a larger concept that incorporates more things. When we talk about digestion later in this semester, we're going to talk about the spleen being extremely important for digestion, like really central. But we know within Western medicine, the spleen organ isn't doing digestion. That's not really its function. But that's because we were never talking about the spleen organ really in the first place. We're also going to talk about it as being the part of your mental capacity that allows you to study and remember things. That's definitely not our Western medicine spleen that's doing that. And when we translate these words, very often students assume that they understand them based on their previous knowledge of the word that we're translating a Chinese concept into. Does this make sense to people? You guys with me here?
Yes, Peter.
Good.
One of my favorite takeaways from Marianne in FCM 1 was that the dream is in the blood, right? Shen, the dream. And that radically changed the way I actually teach. You know what I'm saying? When I teach about blood and blood flow, and just adding that layer of the dream, you know, the aspect of the dream from the big dream is in the blood, and the blood rests at night so the dream can return to the dream, you know, to check in.
Yeah.
And then how at the high point of the day, when the heart is at its fullest or its highest, that's when you go actualize the dream, your aspect of
it's
the
great.
dream.
Yeah. So, and then when we get to the clinical side, when a patient comes in and they're saying, I have trouble falling asleep, I wake up easily all the time, one of the first things we think is, what's going on with their blood? And that might be where we start working. They might have blood deficiency within Chinese medicine, but that doesn't mean that they're anemic within Western medicine. It's a large overlapping Venn diagram. Very often people who are blood deficient within Chinese medicine are also anemic. But it doesn't have to be, and it really doesn't matter. Like their hematocrit test can be above normal, and we can still see them as blood deficient because we're only kind of talking about the same thing here.
Hello, Peter.
Yeah.
If I could share one thing, like for people that may
Please.
have trouble kind of getting it, what I do is I try to figure out the rationale behind the connection, and that usually helps me a little bit. So with the blood, for example, the way that I kind of made the connection is that practitioners probably realize people who had issues with blood circulation, that we know in Western medicine, oxygen has to do with the brain, that maybe they observe people who have bad memory have issues with their blood. So that in the background helps me kind of make that connection.
I appreciate that connection. I'm going to give, if using those sorts of connections helps people learn, that's great. For the people who have a strong Western medicine background, I would recommend trying as hard as you can, at least in the first year, to not draw equivalencies between the two. Because very often it's going to lead to some misunderstandings, because while that's a great example of how we can think of blood and mental functioning working together, at the same time, we often see people who, within a Western medical context, have nothing wrong with their blood, and yet we're treating them for their shui within Chinese medicine, because they're not, when we say blood and when we say shui, we're just not talking about the same thing. There's similarity, there's overlap, but there are also these differences. So if using these tricks helps in learning, that's great, but don't necessarily think that that's true, because a lot of attempts have been, when I was in school, there were a handful of people with Western medicine backgrounds who were trying to connect the nervous system to the functioning of the cardium, and trying to connect the lymphatic system to the sanjiao. And ultimately, most of them didn't end up practicing very much. They'd created these very large models that were trying to integrate Western and Eastern medicine. And there's a lot that can be done with integration, but don't be in a rush to integrate. Most of the people who attempt to do that end up more confused if they start too early. This is one of the challenges of Chinese medicine. It truly is a different way of thinking. Okay, so as we're looking at this, so the question arises, how much do we want to translate? So shui and blood are not the same thing. shui stores the memory. So for people with post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, we see that usually as blood stagnation resting within their system. And when their post-traumatic stress disorder gets triggered, we see that as the blood stagnation beginning to resolve. If that triggering re-traumatizes them, they can accumulate more blood stagnation. So very often with people with post-traumatic stress disorder, I end up using things like bleeding techniques with them. We're talking about drops of blood, not opening a vein. We're not talking about old school Western bloodletting. We're talking about small amounts of blood. But if I want to work with people who have traumatic stored memories, I'm often going to the blood for that. There are people within Chinese medicine who make the argument that the first year of Chinese medicine school should be only learning classical Mandarin, which I think is a little bit much. But they have a little bit of a point, which is some familiarity with the ways in which this is presented in the language it comes from is helpful in understanding it. But the takeaway from all of this is don't assume knowledge about a Chinese medical concept due to the words matching something you already know. That makes sense? Yeah.
So in that example that you just used, the Chinese medicine blood and the Western medicine blood were actually conflated, and they are the same thing. Because you said that in order to treat like a blood stagnation situation, then you would actually go and like manipulate the actual blood in their veins. So I think just the part that I'm a little bit, I just know that I'm going to have to practice at is the fact that sometimes I guess they are conflated and like sometimes they're not. So like
exactly, which makes it harder. That's what we're looking at. So we get lots of overlap, but we also get distinct differences. So I would put something like hematocrit levels over here on the blood side. We just don't care that much what the hematocrit levels of a person are for Chinese medicine. If they're really low, they probably also have blood deficiency within Chinese medicine. They probably also have a problem with their shui. But if this is fine, if this checks out, that doesn't necessarily mean anything for us. That being said, we are also, shui is sometimes referred to as the red substance within Chinese medicine. We are talking about blood in the vessels. We're also talking about other things. Like when we get to pathogens that a person can have, we only have like 6 or 7 pathogens. That's it. And that covers every disease that exists. The only reason we can get away with that is because each one has a lot of nested concepts within it. And the combinatorials, the way in which we combine these concepts results in the 10,000 things. But that means that when we say shui, like we don't break this down into plasma and red blood cells and other things. We're incorporating a lot of concepts together into shui, and some of them are not within blood. Again, the specifics of this aren't very important. I don't need you to know this exactly about blood. This is more as a group of students who are relatively new to Chinese medicine, it's important not to make these early errors of thinking that, shui is easy, sanjiao is hard. I see a lot more people who don't understand blood who are out practicing or who are near graduation than people who don't understand the sanjiao. We approach the sanjiao and we go, that's novel, that's different, and that's confusing because it's in Mandarin. But as soon as we say blood, people go, I got that. And qi is hard, but qi and blood are equally strange and different. So just as you go forward, be careful about the assumptions you're making about the things that you're hearing. That's about it. That's really all I'm saying here. And I'm going to try to not give you guys the wrong impression as we go over a whole bunch of new concepts this semester. Yeah. So the other issue here is if you hear Chinese medicine blood and you go, I understand this, then as new ideas are presented, it can be difficult to change your assumed understanding. So as long as you keep that beginner's mind about all of these ideas, again, especially if you have a background within biomedicine, keeping a beginner's mind about these Chinese medicine concepts is going to be important. It's a little heavy-handed to say that you'll fail as a practitioner if you don't incorporate these ideas this way, but it's very hard to practice Chinese medicine if a lot of the Chinese medicine concepts are actually mapped onto Western medicine concepts exclusively. For the people here who do have a biomedical background, that's going to be both a massive gift and a little bit of a curse as you go forward. Because of that knowledge you already have, it can be a little bit challenging to get into this in the beginning. If you get over that hurdle, it's going to be a huge benefit in your practice. Okay, let's take 10 minutes here. Take a little bit of a break. That was a lot of stuff. And we'll come back and we'll do a little bit of a review and we'll talk about the quiz that you guys have for next week. And then we'll take questions and we'll be done. Sound good? See you guys at 11:30. I'm going to hang out here. So if people have questions they want to ask now, you're welcome to ask them. And I'll just be hanging out.
Hi, Peter. Hi. Oh, okay, no worries.
I should turn my mic on. Give me just 1 second because I'm typing someone something, and I will be right with you. Okay. Yeah. What's up, Kirby?
Because I got on late, I know that I missed your intro to the class, and I just wanted to ask you about Slack. So I know that we need to sign up and join that group. And is there going? I'm sorry that you're gonna have to repeat.
That's fine. It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. Is there going to be outside work, or is it just conversation within Slack?
Yeah. So the Slack isn't mandatory. No one has to use it. It's not required for the class. I strongly recommend people use it because Moodle's, a little mixed. I've had semesters where people are really engaged on the Slack and we're having long conversations and going down all sorts of tangents, and I'm posting notes from other classes and sending excerpts from books. And I've had semesters where people don't really participate much. It's like, okay, well, it's there. Okay. So I think of it more as like just an easy way for us to communicate about the course. I'll still be sending out emails through the normal channels, but like for right now, all of the slides that I have up on Moodle are last semester's slides. So a lot of weeks I'm going to be updating those slides, and I'll often share them in the Zoom as we're starting, but they'll also be up on Slack often the day before as kind of a starting place. That makes sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Angie, there's no textbook. I'm going to give you guys a ton of excerpts from textbooks, but you do not need a book for this class. You're going to get like 100 pages of Machioch's Foundations book sent to you, but so if you have it, that's probably helpful, but you do not need a book for this class. I'm going to recommend about 10 books, but they're for your education in general. They're not for this class in particular. Frankly, at this stage, we do not have Machioch's Foundations of Chinese Medicine is outdated and needs to be replaced, is my opinion. I know people who are working on that project right now. It's outdated. There's good stuff there, but overall. One of the other things that I'll be doing on Slack is when I get questions from individuals, what I've done historically is taken those questions, answered them to that person, and then anonymized the question, and then put the question and the answer up on the Slack so everyone can read it. So if someone says like, I'm sorry, I really don't understand this whole blood shui thing. It's like, okay, I'll type out a response, take the person's name off of it so no one knows who said it, and then put that up, because if you have a question, someone else has the same question almost every time. So I just find it to be a useful place to have a repository of all of that. Yeah. Thanks for the thumbs up. And speaking of which, it's about time for us to come back. You guys take one more minute. I got one thing to look through here. Oh, good. Yeah, we got some good stuff to cover. Okay. So in general, in this class, I'm going to be trying to teach at about this level, but I'm expecting you guys to walk away with about this much, and I'm testing you about here. So if some of this is like, oh, what do you expect me to do with this information? A lot of it is not a whole lot. So we're going to be summarizing this class at the end of the class today with just the takeaways that I want you to have. And when we're going through some of the much more detailed information, I'm going to be going into a level of detail that you do not need in your second semester. And then I'm going to make it very clear, like, here's what I actually want you to know for exams. And try to give you the context. I would like to make it so that you don't have really anything that you have to memorize without also understanding. But I'm not going to be able to pull that off for everything just due to time constraints. But that is a place where Slack can come in. So if things are confusing, you can just have those conversations. Okay, any questions before we dive into the next part? There were a couple during the break. I've done some private chatting with a few people in the Zoom chat. No questions? Okay. If you think of any, feel free to ask. So this next part here should basically all be stuff that you learned in FCM 1. I just want to go over this a little bit again and make sure that it's familiar because, well, because this class builds on FCM 1. And if you didn't internalize this or you've forgotten it, a little refresher will help. So when we talk about anatomy within Chinese medicine, there's not a lot to it. You know, this gets more complicated just due to the number of acupuncture points there are and the number of extra channels there are, but this is all of anatomy within Chinese medicine. Each of these kind of has subcategories, but that's about it. We've got yang and yin, qi, bloods, fluid, shen, jing, the organs, the zong, the fu, and the extraordinary ones. And then we've got the channels, which includes the luos and the divergents and the extraordinary ones and a whole bunch of internal branches. But this really makes up everything that is the body within Chinese medicine. You know, you could say like, okay, well, what about bones and muscle and all these other things? And like, ultimately, those are really just manifestations of the 5 phases. Those are manifestations of the organs. So when we talk about muscles, we're largely talking about earth and wood together. We're largely talking about the spleen and the liver. If that's a new concept to you, don't worry, we're going to go over that later. But this is really, when we talk Chinese medicine, this is what we talk. This is about it. Okay, I got a question up here, and we'll do that before going to the next slide. So Molly asks, something I wonder is why the MSTOM curriculum says to take the anatomy classes early in the program, but all of my teachers recommend to keep knowledge of Western medicine separate from TCM and not to try to find equivalence between the two. Well, so I've sat down, I remember when I was a student, I sat down with some other students and we discussed our gripes with the program and like, man, I wish we had, you know, why don't we have 4 Toi Na classes instead of 2? And we should really be doing Tai Chi all the time, right? And like this Qigong education is really superficial and there's no class on divergence. I want to learn about divergence. And once we'd finished developing the program we would ideally want, it was about 10 years long and cost about $500,000. So there's a lot of things in the way that this program is constructed that are non-ideal in a theoretical infinite time and money, but just practical. It's just the best way to get it done. So while on the one hand, it would be not, on a certain level, it'd be nice to not talk any Western medicine, anything, until either after you're done with most of the Chinese medicine education or do it beforehand. But when you're taking your comprehensive exams, they've put this information on there together. And when you're taking, and you need to know Western medicine for your board exams, and also it's a good thing to know. So the anatomy and physiology goes at the beginning because that's going to feed into pathophysiology and that's going to feed into more and more Western medicine courses. So you're kind of taking like these 2 tracks in parallel. Well, this is MSTOM. So these 3 tracks in parallel, all the Chinese medicine stuff and acupuncture stuff, all of the Western medicine stuff, and all of the herbal stuff. And each one just feeds into the next one and they all kind of have to start at the beginning. It's a little bit challenging to try to keep these different worlds separate in your head while you're studying them all at the same time. I respect that, I understand that, but I'm not quite sure how to better organize it myself. That answer your question? Okay. Well, speaking of anatomy, these things are not anatomy. in Chinese medicine. We don't have nerves within Chinese medicine. We don't have hormones. They don't exist. We never talk about them. They don't matter at all. There is no one-to-one correlate. A lot of people see connections that are there and then go, oh, when, I mentioned this earlier, when we talk about Sanjiao, we're clearly talking about the lymphatic system. It's like, well, kind of, but also not. So we're never going to talk about nerves and we're never going to talk about hormones in these classes. If you were to come to the clinic and we were to work together and I was your supervisor and we had a patient who came in with nerve damage, we would talk about nerves. We would talk about how to treat nerves and how to work with nerves with the tools that we have at hand. But they don't fit into Chinese medical theory. We don't talk about them in that way. And at least for the first year, I'd really recommend against trying to find parallels. So let's go through, so this is anatomy, this isn't anatomy, and we're just gonna go through each of these and touch on them a little bit to give a little bit of a refresher. And please ask questions if we go through, if you have any. So yin and yang, you guys learned about in semester one. One of the challenges of a lot of these Chinese medicine concepts is yin and yang feels like something that is quickly understood and grasped, but it has so many levels and layers at which you can understand it that very often people are like, oh, yin and yang, I get that. And they lose that curiosity and that deeper exploration of it. I would recommend assuming that even if yin and yang makes complete sense to you in your own head, assuming that there's still a lot more to learn. At the stage I'm at, I still learn new things about yin and yang regularly. I see a lot of how I treat patients as basically only working on yin and yang. And I get pretty good results. And I've had the experience moderately regularly of talking to other acupuncturists and describing things in terms of yin and yang and having them go, I don't think about that. I don't understand that. And that's happened when people have come to me asking, like, I consult with some friends moderately regularly, and I've had people come to me and say, like, I've got this case that's complicated in this way and this way. And once I start talking about yin and yang, they're like, this isn't, I don't do that anymore. I would recommend continuing to do it because it works well. Every organ has both yin and yang. Yin, the easiest way I think of this is yin is basically potential energy, and then yang is kinetic energy or active energy. So I think of this as gasoline versus the movement of a car. Every organ has both of these things, but we don't talk about both of these things for every organ. So in theory, we have spleen yin, but we never talk about spleen yin. There are no herbs that nourish spleen yin. There are no acupuncture points that nourish spleen yin. It just isn't a thing. So every organ has both these form and function. Generally, when we're talking about yin damage to an organ, we're talking about damage to the physical structure of it. So stomach ulcers are an example of stomach yin damage. When someone's tongue begins peeling, if they begin losing chunks off the top of their tongue, it's a reflection of yin damage in their internal system. When we're talking about yang damage, we're talking about lack of function. So someone whose stomach lining is just fine, but for some reason they just don't digest food, we're often talking about stomach and spleen, yang. When we talk about a person's overall yin and yang, like if I say this person seems very yin deficient, we're generally talking about the kidneys when we say that. And we'll get to why that's the kidneys when we talk about the individual organs. When we talk about blood and qi, we're kind of talking about yin and yang again. I'm gonna draw this really quick. And of course, normally this would be on a whiteboard in front of the class. I'm just gonna mention really quick, there is also fluids. I'm only mentioning that because I'm about to put it on this chart. So when we're talking about a person, we have the spectrum, yin on one side, yang on the other, qi, blood, fluids in the middle, with this being thick fluids and this being thin fluids. So this is the spectrum. A patient who has problems with their yang is much more likely to have problems with their qi as well. A patient with the problems with their yin is much more likely to have problems with their blood. So this is on a spectrum from yin to yang. So blood is more yang than yin is. Qi is more yin than yang is, and fluids are somewhere in the middle, with the thick and the thin straddling that line. We're going to see this over and over again throughout the semester and throughout your entire education, that many aspects of the body and pathology fit into these yin-yang pairs. So we have this very obvious one. Yin and yang are clearly a yin-yang pair by definition, but blood and qi are also a yin and yang pair. So blood is yin and yang, but mostly yin, nourishes, moistens, and provides stability. And qi is yin and yang, but mostly yang. So our actions, our movement, the functioning of the organs is going to be largely qi. In theory, just like yin and yang, every organ has qi and blood. But just like yin and yang, we don't talk about it for every organ. I mentioned there's really no spleen yin. There's also really no spleen blood. In theory, those both exist. And there are actually a couple of people who've theorized the concept of spleen blood, and we have a couple of treatments, but you're never going to learn about them in school. You may learn about them in the future afterwards. But each organ has these things, has things we focus on and ones we don't. We never talk about stomach blood. We don't have points for stomach blood, and we don't have herbs for stomach blood. But we do have points and herbs for stomach yin. Again, don't worry about the specifics of which organs have what. We'll talk about that much later. This little chart should be familiar, right? You guys all saw this in FCM 1? Can I get some Y's and N's in the chat if you guys have seen this or not? If the answer is no, we're going to spend more time on it. Yes, good. Some no's, mostly yeses. Okay, not this exact one. Okay, fair enough. Okay, so this is from Machiocha. Yeah, need a reminder. Great, no problem. So we care a lot about whether or not people have qi and blood. A lot of when we put needles into a person, we're affecting their qi, we're moving their qi. Someone who's really qi deficient often can barely feel the needles. They don't have anything to move. So we care about whether or not they're producing qi and blood. Every time you move your body, you're using up qi. Every time, all the maintenance that occurs in your body all the time is using up blood. We're constantly draining our qi and blood out of us. You could think of this similar to the usage of ATP in our system, something that constantly needs to be revivified and refilled. Not the same thing, but a similar sort of concept. So when we're talking about making qi, we need to know, how does this happen? When we talk about, if we're talking about within Western medicine, how do we produce energy within the body? We tend to look at what is in food, and then whether or not the person can ingest it through the stomach, through the small intestine, through the large intestine. That's most of what we're looking at. Within Chinese medicine, we also have the idea that, so we have this combination. To make qi, food is important, but we also need breathing. Without the combination of proper food, proper functioning of the spleen, good air, and proper functioning of the lungs, we can't go through this process that ends up with us making yin and wei qi at the end of it, the nutritive and defensive qi. So like the name implies, defensive qi is what we use to fight off diseases that are coming in from the outside. A person who gets sick all the time, one of the first things we're going to be looking at is, why are they not making this qi? And we get to look back through this entire chain of pieces to figure out where that problem is. To make qi, we have to use qi. This is one of the ironies, not ironies. It's one of the things that's important to us in Chinese medicine. So someone who's very qi deficient is often going to have trouble digesting food in the first place to make qi. We'll talk about that when we get to spleen in like week 8. Don't worry too much about all these different types of qi, the gathering, original, true, nutritive, defensive. We'll talk about these a little bit more in the semester, but the basic picture is the spleen makes food qi. The lungs make air qi. This is often said as, lungs make da qi, which translates as the big qi. Spleen makes gu qi, food qi. These gather together in the chest. A little bit of yin qi comes up from the kidneys and transforms that into the qi that we use in day-to-day life. you need to memorize this chart. It's going to make more and more sense as you go through the program. This should make complete sense in about a year. It should make decent sense now, but you need to know this chart backwards and forwards and up and down. And the same is true of making blood. Similar process, except that when it comes to making blood, we don't care. So when we're making blood, the spleen makes gu qi, sends it up to the lungs, but we don't have da qi here. We don't care about the person's breath. That doesn't matter for the making of blood within Chinese medicine. The spleen raises the qi up to the lungs send the qi to the heart combines with the original qi, the yin qi, and a little bit of jing, often called a spark coming up from the kidneys, almost like a catalyst within the person's system. And that's how we produce blood. So within the Chinese medicine model, blood is created in the heart. That's the place where it originates. Again, an example of how when we say the heart, we're not talking about exactly the same things that we're talking about within Western medicine. Some of the reasons that this is interesting. Let's say you get a patient who comes in. Okay, let me add a couple steps to this. Can someone type in the chat what the emotion related to metal is? Great, grief, nailed it. So a patient who has a lot of unprocessed grief, that's going to affect their lungs. Often it causes qi stagnation within the lungs. If a person has a lot of qi stagnation within the lungs, the spleen might be working properly. It might produce this food qi, this gu qi, but when it tries to go up to the lungs, it won't be able to because of the stagnation that exists there. Due to this grief congestion, kind of clogging up the chest, there's more specific terms, but I don't need to get things complicated right now. Due to this congestion, the stagnation within the chest, they're unable to move this qi through to the heart to produce blood. Doesn't matter what they eat. Doesn't matter what nutritionist they go to. They might be massively anemic within a Western medicine sense. Their ability to make their food doesn't matter for the production of blood if their lungs are congested enough that it can't pass through there. So sometimes patients come in, they've lost a loved one 2 years ago, and they're still cold and have no energy and exhausted all the time and can't sleep well. And through release of that stagnation within the lungs, which we might use something like a front mu point, an alarm point of the lungs to do, all of a sudden they're able to produce blood. Sometimes this person comes to you and they've been to 10 different nutrition specialists to try to figure out why. They might come in and say, I've got leaky gut syndrome. I've got one of 100 different digestive disorders. But as we delve into it, sometimes it's just these emotions sitting there. And we'll go into how that works week 3. So ultimately, this comes up, combines in the heart, and that's how we produce blood. So if you're having trouble creating blood, it can come from any of the organs in this pathway. In the same way that if we're having trouble making qi, it can come from either of these organs as well. So one of the things for people who are always tired that often gets recommended is learning how to breathe deeply. And within within, let's say, the yoga world, that's generally a known thing. It's like, oh, it's important to be able to breathe deeply and use like the diaphragm and also the muscles in the chest and the accessory muscles. You need to engage all 3 of these different things to get enough air to have energy. It's good for you. And when in Chinese medicine, we say, yeah, because otherwise you can't produce qi. We have fluids. There's 2 types of fluids. There's thick fluids and there's thin fluids. The thin fluids are relatively yang. The thick fluids are relatively yin. Thin fluids are things like tears and saliva and nasal mucus. Thick fluids are things like synovial fluids, the fluids that are in our joints, the things that really lubricate the parts of our bodies that work heavily. Thin fluids move easily and quickly around the body. Thick fluids are relatively stationary and don't move very much. The fluids chart has a couple problems with it because this is really, so this is origin, transformation, and excretion of body fluids, but they didn't really get the origin part correctly. But still, this is a pretty good way of understanding it. I'm going to repeat here. I expect you to know this chart, and this chart for the midterm. And there'll be a midterm review, so don't worry too much about taking notes right now. This is the pattern of how we recycle fluids within the body and how we get rid of them. This is mostly talking about thin fluids that circulate through the body. We're less talking about the Ye, more the Jin. But we have this entire system. Very often we'll see people who come in with something like, what's a good example here? A person who comes in with a dry cough, and they say, like, it just literally feels dry in my lungs. And we take their pulse and look at their tongue, and we see a complete lack of fluids in their lungs, but they've got swollen ankles. They've got accumulation of fluids in their lower body. If we look at this chart, we can see here that the kidneys are supposed to steam, in quotation marks, fluids up to the lungs to moisten the lungs. If this isn't happening, the person can have plenty of fluids in their system, but there's an issue within their circulation that prevents it from getting to one area. We can use acupuncture points on the kidney meridian and the lung meridian together to just get rid of that, to unblock that. The flip side of this is we've got a number of types of externally contracted diseases, kind of like the cold, where you get things like facial swelling as a symptom. One of the lungs' jobs is to descend fluids out of the head and out of the upper body. So someone suddenly gets this accumulation of these fluids in the upper body, that's a sign for us that something is stagnant within the lungs. A little bit of acupuncture, I've seen that drain out of a person's face in 10 minutes. So we have these little systems to understand how these things interconnect. For now, you're just memorizing this. By the end of the semester, you should understand why every single one of these things is happening. I would not attempt to connect any of this to Western medicine. The bladder excretes fluids, that's pretty clear, but the rest of this we'll come back to later. One of the examples of how this is different from a Western medicine way of looking at it is here we say the small intestine does most of the fluid absorbing, whereas we know in Western medicine, it's largely the large intestine. And that's in part because we're not really talking about the small and large intestine when we say small and large intestine. Okay. In addition to qi, yin, yang, qi, blood, and fluids, we have the shen and the jing. This is another yin-yang pair. The shen is the yang aspect, the jing is the yin aspect, and the shen is the closest we can get to describing what is the part that's you. Now, on a certain level, all of the qi and the blood and the yin and the yang is the vehicle that we travel in, and the shen is the part that is most you. People can lose their shen through trauma, through events in their life. The shen can scatter. We'll talk about how that works in week 3. And if we get to it, we'll do a lecture on the Chinese medicine conception of both trauma and possession in like week 12. The shen can scatter. We use a system of diagnosis looking at the person's eyes to figure out whether or not that's happened and how to work with that. And on the flip side of that, we have the jing, which is the deepest reservoir of resources for the physical form. So if the shen is you at like a spiritual level, at when people talk about their true self or their higher self, we're talking about the shen. When we talk about the jing, we're talking about the essence and reserves that form your physical body, but also the thing that balances out the shen, because this is a yin-yang pair. So when we talk about a person's destiny or their karmic job in their life, or when someone says like, I've truly found my path, we're talking about something that's embedded in the jing. It's within the jing that these things are contained within a person. It's also your constitution. Whether or not you're going to be tall enough to be a star basketball player is determined by your jing. Whether or not you have genetic disorders, that's in your jing. You get your jing from your parents, and that jing, to a certain degree, has the map of your life within it. That mixes with the shen to create the manifestation of your life. But both of these are given to you upon birth. We'll go into the shen a bit more week 3 as well. This making sense to you guys so far? This should be like review and then deeper. That about what's happening? When we're talking about the organs, we've got the solid organs, the zang, and the hollow organs, the fu. we're going to spend a third of the semester talking about these. We're going to spend 3 to 4 weeks. We're going to spend 4 weeks covering these in so much detail, really giving you guys a strong foundation for all of these organs. But this is the list here. You should definitely know these. You should know their elements. You should know whether they're yin or yang. You should know how they pair up. You should know the organ clock. I assume you know all of these things already. We're not really going to talk about the extraordinary organs here. There's a great book on the extraordinary organs. Do I still have that here? I don't have it here. There's a great book on the extraordinary organs that I'm working through right now that discusses how Chinese medicine conceptualizes the brain. I'm currently working through this book. I got a couple patients with repeat concussions and traumatic brain injuries, which is a subspecialty that I'm getting interested in because it's everywhere and Western medicine doesn't have a lot to offer. There's great discussions of what is the brain within Chinese medicine. Our cognition is largely stored within the heart. So what's this thing doing up here within a Chinese medicine sense? And the extraordinary organs, also the blood vessels, and in women, the uterus, and to a certain degree, the gallbladder, which we'll talk about later. And then we have the channels. The channels work as both a manifestation of the organs and as a piece of the organs themselves. So there are some styles of acupuncture. I can send an image here. Wang Zhuyi, I want to say, yeah, that's his name. Wang Zhuyi is a practitioner from China, and this is the book that's been written on his approach, which is a lineage that he inherited called Applied Channel Theory. For the people here who are extremely kinesthetic in their approach and really tactile, this can be an interesting way of looking at Chinese medicine. They do much of their diagnosis by palpating the channels. So yeah, the pulse and the tongue are nice, but they come in and they spend time like pushing and feeling, and every little bit of the channel and the bumps that show up, or the empty spaces, or a little bit of gumminess, that all means something within their system and determines their treatments. Because the channels tell you what's going on in the organs. The channels tell you what's going on in the internal system, just like the tongue does, just like the pulse does, just like the ears do, just like the abdomen does. We have all of these ways of seeing the whole within a part of it, and the channels are one of them. The regular channels are also where all of our where all the acupuncture points you're going to learn now are. We have a whole bunch of acupuncture points that aren't on channels too. This is also where the qi travels through. And it's also a place where the pathogens can travel through. So we talk about a person getting a wind cold, often entering through Du14 on the back of the neck. The first symptom of a wind cold being tightness in the back of the neck. Again, it's coming through a specific point. Often we needle and or cup that point to undo this, to reverse that. And then underneath those regular channels, at the deepest part of our channel system, we have our extraordinary channels sitting there. Extraordinary is not a great translation of the phrase. Curious, strange, confounding, unknowable, these are all kind of better translations. And one of the things this is another one of those differences between Eastern and Western thinking things. When we say curious or strange, we don't mean we don't understand them. We mean that they are not supposed to be understood in the way that other things are. It means that this is one of the places where weird stuff is. This is where the rules break down a little bit. So often this is working with the extraordinary channels is something people get into relatively late in their career. Not always, but often, because they behave a little strangely. The Ren and the Du are fairly accessible, but the Dai Meridian, for example, can be very strange to work with. I've gotten odd results from working with that. There's debate within different schools of thought about whether they house pathology. You'll be taught about like, oh, an excess yin wei versus a deficient yin wei, and they manifest in these symptoms. And you'll need to memorize those for board exams. But you're probably not going to interact with the concepts a ton while you're in school. And that's probably okay. For the people who are interested in women's health, spending some time looking at the Chong meridian is really useful. The Chong meridian rises up kind of through the uterus. It rises up the midline, and it comes up and circles around the face here. And with women who have polycystic ovarian syndrome, which I mentioned earlier, and a number of other hormonal disorders where you see facial hair growth, the facial hair grows exactly, in most people, where the Chong meridian lies on the face, which is kind of interesting. When we talk about why do men grow beards and women don't within Chinese medicine, we see the beards as basically the male version of menstruation, that the women are losing this blood through their menstruation on a monthly basis, and the Chong runs differently in men and comes up and produces facial hair instead. And so when you get these hormonal issues which cause changes in menstruation, it's something going on with the Chong vessel. Many different things can be going on in the Chong vessel. I'm not trying to be vague, I'm just trying to keep it at the level we're at, which results in the hair growing as well. We've got other channels. We got the Luo channels. We got the divergent channels. We use these for all sorts of things. You're mostly going to learn about this within your acupuncture points classes. When we talk about, so I've seen a lot of patients who've gone through some sort of trauma, house grief. It affects their lungs for a little while, and then it ends up affecting their large intestine, and they end up with one of many different digestive disorders, from irritable bowel syndrome to ulcerative colitis to leaky gut to just a big question mark and a lot of pain in their intestines. So that's going to transmit from the yin metal organ to the yang metal organ. And very often people stop their thinking there because we just know that the yin and yang organs transmit to each other. But if we look at these pathways, there's specific places where that transmission occurs. There are very clear lines that connect these different, all of the organs in the ways that they connect. You guys, I'm sure, have heard about some of like the meridian meeting points, these places where two different meridians cross and we get an acupuncture point. Those things allow us to interact with the connections between organs. And the Luos and divergence are two different things that do that. Luo source combinations are really powerful. I use them regularly. You're going to learn about them soon if you haven't already, but yeah. So that's pretty much all the new information I want to go over today. Just a quick review. This is what we're learning this semester: internal pathology, external pathology, miscellaneous, we're going to touch on, but not a whole lot about it. This is really all I want you to know about the epistemology stuff. Yin and Yang is the foundation, the philosophical floor of our medicine. So all the things that we think about when we think about Chinese medicine should ultimately be rooted in Yin and Yang. The 5 phases is just a fancy version of Yin and Yang. I'd really like you guys to be able to reproduce the celestial cross. And we use the 5 phases to look at Yin and Yang and how it plays out over time. We'll go into that a little more next week. And the more you understand the 5 phases, the more you get some predictive power about how diseases will evolve and change, or whether someone who is somewhat deficient in one season is going to end up sick in another. I've got a private question here. I'll get to that in 1 second. Be careful with names and assuming that you understand stuff. We covered that pretty thoroughly. And just make sure you're familiar with that FCM1 review. And that's pretty much everything from today. I'm going to go over the quiz that I'm going to send you guys, but before I do that, does anyone have any questions? How has this been for you guys? It's a bit for day 1, and it's a little bit fuzzy. I'm not expecting you guys to remember this all at a very deep level. I will in other weeks, but this week not so much. How are you guys doing?
I have a quick question about the fluid. So you were saying there's facial swelling, that's usually like an indication issues with the lung. And then if it's below, it's more of an issue with the kidneys. But if you're like all over, is that more like your spleen? Because I know spleen has to do with some edema as well.
Yeah.
So if it was like everywhere, would you not think it's not separate, but you know what I mean? Like, would you think more so spleen than like, okay, it's an issue with the lung if it was face and body?
So someone who's who like retains water, let's say, or who perceives themselves to be that way, or someone who has like edema over a lot of their body, we've got a differential diagnosis. There's about 6 things that are highly likely that it might be. And we use looking at the tongue, checking the pulse, and asking some questions to try to narrow down that list. It can easily be the spleen, but it can also have something to do with the small intestine not separating the clear from the turbid. It can be generalized stagnation. So sometimes people who've had a systemic injury, like someone who's been hit by a car, a year later, they might still just be swollen. They're healed. Everything's better as far as can be told within a Western medicine context, but they might just be covered in qi stagnation from a Chinese medicine perspective. We unblock them and all of a sudden they're like, I've been peeing every half an hour for 2 days. So you're going to hear the phrase, it depends, a lot while you're in school, and I'm going to try to avoid that phrase as much as possible. In this case, we have to run a differential diagnosis. So even the example of like facial swelling that I mentioned earlier, that's not the only reason we can get facial swelling. There's a whole bunch of reasons we can get it, but that's a fairly common one, and that chart illustrates it, which is why I brought it up there. But yeah, when someone has systemic swelling, the first thing I usually look for is where's the stagnation. That's the first thing I look for. But it can also, it's often spleen related. Yeah.
Thank you.
That help? Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
I have a question as well.
Shoot.
So Peter, you said that we in acupuncture don't talk about nerves and hormones specifically. And then, so I'm thinking to myself, and you also mentioned that if a patient comes in and he mentions that he has some, let's say we also talked about the behavioral and emotional mental health, right? Which are closely connected to hormones, for instance, right? And then if person, let's say, has some neurological issue, how do you address this issue, not talking about it in terms of anatomy and physiology? And I'm also taking anatomy and physiology to this term, which is predominantly talks about neurology. So yes, I'm trying to figure out the best way to think about all that.
I completely get your question and the confusion / frustration that you probably have. So we got to separate out Chinese medicine theory from Chinese medicine practice in the United States when working with people who are coming from Western medicine. So in theory, in our Chinese medicine anatomy, nerves and hormones don't exist. We don't have a way to talk about them. We do see all of the disorders that come from damage to nerves or hormonal imbalances. We just have different language for it. So someone who has hypothyroidism, for example, that's often going to be kidney yang deficiency, but it can be other things. We've got like maybe 7 types of hypothyroidism within Chinese medicine, or 7 completely different ways of treating hypothyroidism, depending on the person's presentation. So we care about their nerves and about their endocrine system. And in practice, I do things using electricity and needles that work with people's nerves directly. Like I'm not ignoring it, but in theory, you want to learn how to work with these things separately and then clinically integrate them more when you're an intern at the school. So for now, just try to put a little bit of a wall between those two. When we talk about endocrine disorders within Western medicine, we talk about all those things in Chinese medicine. We just don't talk about hormones because we don't have them. Just as we don't have germ theory in Chinese medicine. There's no bacteria or viruses. Obviously, there's bacteria and viruses, but we use different language to discuss it. It's really a linguistic thing, but it's not correlative. It's different.
Mm-hmm.
This is part of the reason why I was saying people with a Western medicine background. I'm looking at the wall behind you here, where you literally have endocrine system over your head. People who are coming from a Western medicine background, this part of it is hard. This part of like, wait, but how do we talk about the endocrine system without having the endocrine system? It's crazy. It's like, well, try it out for a little bit. We have a different way of talking about it, and we have different. And so I'm going to spend one more minute on this. So someone comes in, they come in with their thyroid panel, let's say, and we look through what's going on. And we're like, okay, here's your hyperthyroidism right here. You've seen an endocrinologist, you talked to them. Here's the list of the 50 common symptoms that come with hyperthyroidism. And if we took 10 people with your same thyroid panel and the same diagnosis within Western medicine, different people are going to have different symptoms. There's going to be some fairly universal ones, and there's going to be some that are unique to each patient. Those unique aspects within Western medicine are generally kind of ignored. Like, look, we know from your thyroid panel what's going on. We fix that, symptoms should resolve. If not, sometimes that happens. I'm being blasé, but that's the basic way of thinking about it. And in Chinese medicine, we care about those distinctions. So two different people with the exact same thyroid panel might come in, and we will give them completely different herbal formulas, like not a single ingredient the same, and completely different acupuncture. And there might be two people who come in, one with hyperthyroidism, one with hypothyroidism, and we might treat them exactly the same, because within Chinese medicine, we could see it as being quite similar. This is a massive generalization. The specifics are complex, but it's a completely different way of approaching these things.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And keep asking those questions because it can be frustrating. Any other questions? I would like to, I need to pull up a file here. 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to email this to everybody in just a second. I should have had this up already. So you guys should recognize the chart that I'm about to show you. This chart, this should look familiar. I mean, I wrote this one out, but you should recognize this from FCM1, right? Yeah?
Yes.
Good. So I'm going to send all of you the full chart, and I'm also going to send you an empty chart. And I want you to practice filling this in. And by the midterm, normally in class, I ask you to I just make this a quiz week 2, but there's literally no way to make this a quiz on Moodle. I need you to be able to fill this in from memory, like that. These are, for anyone here who has a musical background, these are the scales of Chinese medicine. You just need to know them. There's no way around it. You should be able to, in your sleep, up, down, left, right, backwards, and forwards, fill in this chart. By the end of the semester, you should also understand why for pretty much every piece of this chart. Like right now, I'm just memorize it, and we're going to fill in the why a little bit later, but I need you to know this so that we can play with this information. So that when I say to you, a patient comes in with a stomach-related issue, which sensory organ do you expect that to show up in? I need you in your head to be able to go down this chart and go, okay, there's stomach, and then the sense organ related is mouth. Or does this make sense? By the midterm, we're going to be playing with this with the generating and controlling cycle. So a patient with, let's see, what's a good way to do this? A patient with liver excess causing it to overact is going to manifest in problems with which tissue? And I want you to be able to do that math. We'll go over a little bit the pieces of that, but I want you to be able to go, okay, wood overacts on earth, which means liver overacts on spleen and or stomach. And if it's overacting on the spleen or stomach, then we'd expect to see problems in the muscles, which is the reason that you get muscle twitches and muscle cramps when you're extremely stressed within Chinese medicine, for example. That makes sense? I don't want you to be able to do all those pieces quite yet, but can you guys, I'm gonna send this to you, and I just want you to be able to memorize this and fill in this chart for next week. That good? Okay. Class is officially over for week 1. Congratulations. I'm gonna hang out for like another 10, 15 minutes. Anyone who has questions, welcome to ask. Come hang out on the Slack. I'm gonna post the invitation link to the Slack one more time for anyone who's missed it. And of course, if you encounter it later, feel free to just email me and ask for it, and we'll fill it in there. This is talking to me on Slack is the best way to do it. I'll get back to you faster there and fill in more information. And yeah, otherwise I'll see you guys next week. Thanks, everybody. And anyone who has questions, hang out. I'll be here for a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you.